Hi there, everyone. I want to welcome you to part 3 of my week 5 video, Ethos, Logos, and Pathos. And these are some really important foundational concepts of English 1010, and they are critical to your success with paper 2. So hopefully you are hanging in there with me and tuning in for this last video of the week. So to follow along with me, click on Content, Course Documents, and then Ethos, Logos, and Pathos. And so you see a picture there of Aristotle, and I'm sure that many of you have heard of him. He was a very famous Greek philosopher, and love that interesting hairdo there. I guess that was pretty popular back in his day. It kind of reminds me of what my husband used to look like when he had hair. My dad used to tease him and say, "Charlie, the Lord's been good to you. He gave you one face and cleared off a place for another." My husband didn't like that very much, but anyway, I thought it was funny. So good old Aristotle, and you might wonder, what he has to do with us in English 1010 now, all these many centuries later. And the reason that we're focusing on him is because not only was he a very important thinker and originator of much of Western thought in terms of philosophy and etc., but he also came up with some core ideas about rhetoric. So we've mentioned that word a little bit before in the syllabus. You've seen it floating around. And so now we're going to really define it and get into the heart and soul of it, because this paper that you are going to write for paper 2 is a rhetorical analysis, and so it really connects. So logos, ethos, and pathos are all concepts invented by our buddy there, Aristotle. So what is rhetoric? And that's one of those words that you kind of think you know what it means, but you're not totally sure you know what it means. And often nowadays when we hear it, it's on one of the news channels when someone's talking about the rhetoric of Senator whomever, and so you kind of get the gist of the meaning, but you're not totally sure. Well, for our purposes, I want you to think of rhetoric as effective communication, all right? And so the word rhetoric is defined as the art of being able to communicate, whether it's through speaking or writing or even visual means, effectively. The use of figures of speech and other techniques that writers use. And so it's effective communication. So every time you hear that word rhetoric, that's what I want you to think. And if on a quiz I ask you, what is rhetoric? What does it mean? Effective communication. So the ability to communicate your message effectively and successfully through the written word, through the spoken word, and as I say, even through visual mediums. And so if we were in a real classroom setting, I would ask you to think about what you are wearing at the moment, because what you're wearing is a form of rhetoric. So when you get up and get ready to go somewhere in the morning, you might not be consciously thinking that you're presenting rhetoric to the world, but you are. So if you're a person who likes to dress really, in a flamboyant way, and you like a lot of color, that says something about the message you're sending out to the world. And if you're getting up in the morning and you think, well, I don't really want to stand out today, so I'm just going to wear something very nondescript, just, something that doesn't have a lot of color in it so that I just sort of blend into the wall behind me or whatever. Even then, you're kind of sending out a message. And sometimes we wear t-shirts or, other items of clothing that literally have a message written on them. And just the same way, if you are driving down the road and you see a billboard for Cracker Barrel, restaurant, an old country store, that's a visual means of rhetoric. They're sending out a message of effective communication to you. They're saying, hey, you don't want to stop at McDonald's. You want to come to the Cracker Barrel, where you can get real wholesome, good country home cooking, and sweet people who call you honey will come up to your table and wait on you. And you've got the old country store. You can go shopping. That's the part I really like. So that too is a form of rhetoric. Now, I have a friend that I went to graduate school with, and she's now the composition director at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And so when we were in grad school and we were graduate teaching associates, she would come walking in the room, and she was a person who liked piercings and tattoos, and she would dye her hair blue or pink or whatever. And when she would come walking into the classroom on the first day, students were stunned when she would walk up behind the podium, because her visual rhetoric did not present her as a professor, right? They weren't expecting her to look like that. But that was the message that she wanted to send out to the world, because she's a very energetic person, and she's a very, forward-thinking person, and this was the kind of message she wanted to send out. So pretty much, every kind of message that we send, it has these elements that Aristotle came up with, these 3 rhetorical appeals. So you want to engrave in gold letters on your brain: rhetoric equals effective communication through the written word, the spoken word, visual mediums. So every communication is essentially a trilateral relationship. It has 3 sides, like a triangle. And each point of the triangle influences the other 2 points. And all of them are influenced by context, the atmosphere surrounding that communication. So that means the time in which the communication is happening, the place where it's happening, the norms of the society in that time. And each point of the triangle bears some responsibility for the success of the communication as a whole. And each point of the triangle corresponds with one of Aristotle's 3 appeals: ethos, logos, pathos. Those are Greek words, and we're going to talk about them here in just a moment. So Aristotle said there are 3 ways that you can appeal to your audience, whether you're speaking, whether you're writing, whether you're drawing something or creating an advertisement or a billboard or whatever it is. And that's through ethos, pathos, and or logos, right? And all 3 of them are important. I want to give you an example of context before we move any further, that atmosphere that surrounds every communication. And here's a pretty good example. Let's say that I stood up in Birmingham, Alabama in 1850. So this is during the antebellum period, when slavery is at its height, before the Civil War. And I stand up on the town square and I proclaim all people are equal, regardless of their color, and slavery should be abolished, and we should have equal rights for all and no racism whatsoever. What would happen to me? So think about the context. Think about the place, the time, the social norms. Think about the fact that slavery is at the basis of the South's economy, right? Well, what's going to happen to me? It's not going to be good. If I'm white, I'm going to be, ostracized. I might be run out of town, or worse. If I'm black, I'll probably get killed. Now, what if I stood up in Birmingham, Alabama in 1970, after the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s, okay? Hopefully, if I declared the message that all people are equal and they should all be treated equally regardless of color, hopefully then I would not be ostracized or run out of town. If I stood up in 1960, before the Civil Rights Movement, and said it, I probably would be run out of town or worse. So that's context, right? It's the time in which this is happening, the place in which it's happening, and the social norms of this place in time. So now let's think about those 3 appeals that Aristotle said. There are 3 ways that we can appeal to our readers in our writing, or to our listeners in our speaking. One of them is logos. So when you hear that Greek word logos, think logic, okay? So it's an appeal based on logic or reasoning. And so we might do that through facts that we present in an essay, through case studies, statistics, experiments where we present the results, logical reasoning in our papers, analogies, and or through citing the experts. So, oftentimes students say, well, gosh, I'm not an expert in this field. I don't know what I'm doing here. Well, you might not be an expert, but you can cite in your papers people who are, right? Or you can cite reliable sources, and all of that sets up your own logos for your readers, your sense of logic. And think about it too. If I am speaking to you, and maybe I appeal to you emotionally, and maybe I seem really credible to you, but what I'm saying just isn't logical and makes no sense, you're probably not going to listen to me, right? And so the next way that Aristotle said we need to appeal is through ethos, a Greek word that means ethics. Think ethics. So it's an appeal based on the character, the credibility, the reliability, the trustworthiness of the communicator, the speaker, or the writer. So how credible, how reliable, how trustworthy does this writer seem to you? And you want to ask yourself this when you're reading, but you also want to think about how you, as a writer, set up your own ethos. So you can do that, again, through using expert testimony in your paper. You might not be an expert in the field that you're writing about, but you can cite sources that are, right? Reliable sources. And you can do that through not being disrespectful to anyone who would disagree with you. And we call that manner of delivery. That's what Aristotle called it. So that's where you address the opposition respectfully and tactfully in an argumentative paper. So you're not going to, in your paper, degrade anyone who disagrees with you. Rather, you're going to address them in a respectful way when you mention the opposition and refute the opposition. So, for example, on the floor of the Senate, when our senators get in a heated debate, they refer to my honorable opponent rather than, my low-down, good-for-nothing, rotten opponent. Now, I realize things have kind of disintegrated here in the last few years with politics, but still, hopefully, there's a sense of ethos going on there. And then the third appeal that Aristotle mentions, and if you scroll on down, you'll see a diagram of what we call the rhetorical triangle with ethos, logos, and pathos there. And the third one is pathos, an appeal based on emotion. So think empathy, pathos. Now, there are two ways that we can do that. In our writing, in our speaking, in whatever it is, visual means of appealing. We can do that through appealing to the higher emotions of a belief in fairness and justice and love and regard for others. Or we can do that through appealing to the lower emotions of greed and lust and revenge. So let me give you an example there. We see a lot of pathos in advertisements. And so, for example, if you watch the commercial with the Sarah McLachlan music and the poor animals who are out in the cold freezing and suffering and being neglected, that's really based on the higher emotions of love and pity and empathy, right? And every time I see them, I tear up. My husband thinks I'm silly, but I tear up. But then sometimes you'll see advertisements in a magazine, or a commercial that's appealing to you on a lower level of greed or revenge or lust or whatever. So you'll see an advertisement with this beautiful looking person in it, and they're selling a product, and so that's kind of appealing to your lust there, right? Or maybe you see a magazine ad that says something about ladies, use this lip gloss, and the basic message is this lip gloss will just change your life and make everyone love you and just instantly make you desirable and amazing, and right? Or men, you need to buy this truck. This truck will make you a real man, right? It's ram tough, or whatever it is. So kind of appealing to your lower emotions where you want to keep up with the Joneses. You want to have that greed, or You want to be better than someone else or get back at someone else or whatever. So, so those are some examples of pathos there. And just think about it this way. I would submit to you that every communication is using rhetoric in some way to appeal, right? Every communication is an appeal. So even if someone says, well, good morning, that's an appeal to you, right? It's trying to persuade you that in fact it is a good morning. If someone asks you for directions to get somewhere, and you start giving them directions, that might feel as if you're not in any way trying to appeal to the person, but you are. By making yourself seem credible, you want the person to believe you that you're going to give them correct directions. And logical, you want to make sure the directions make sense, So if you think about it, you're using logos, ethos, and pathos every day in your life, every day. And you can probably think of a time right now when you recently used one or all of those appeals in order to persuade someone of something in your life. And so we see how that works in real life and how it works in writing and how important that rhetorical triangle is. So in paper 2, we're looking at ethos, logos, and pathos in either Ain't I a Woman by Sojourner Truth or Salvation by Langston Hughes. Remember too that an absence of ethos, logos, or pathos gives you something to think about and write about. So why might a particular appeal be absent in a reading? What effect does it have on the overall success of the author's argument? So maybe the piece is logos driven. It has a lot of logic, but not as much emotion. Maybe it's pathos driven. Maybe it has a lot of emotion, but not as much logic. Why might that be the case? Well, that probably depends on who the audience is, who the target or primary audience is, the people you're aiming for to persuade, or who the secondary audience is, the invoked audience, the people who are sort of brought into the rhetorical conversation. They weren't your targeted audience, but nevertheless, they are somehow brought into the situation. So an example of target versus secondary or invoked audience would be, let's say that you have a roommate and you're working on paper 2, and your nosy roommate who is trying to look for juicy romantic letters that you've been writing comes across paper 2. Well, that nosy roommate would not be your primary or target audience for paper 2, right? Your primary targeted audience would be me and your classmates. But the nosy neighbor is nevertheless brought into the rhetorical situation, brought into the discourse there, because he or she read your paper. So now that roommate becomes the invoked or the secondary audience. So that's just a little lesson there. So back to an absence of one of the appeals or a lessening of one of them. It's based on who the audience is and what the purpose is. So different types of writing and communications have different types of main audiences and different purposes, different exigencies, reasons why the communication is important at this moment in time. So if I'm speaking before a group of scientists, for example, people who are really fact-based and they're logically driven in their thinking process, I'm probably going to use a lot of logos, a lot of logic, and less emotion in order to appeal to them effectively, more so. But if I'm speaking to a group of creative writers, people like me, who are the dreamers of the world and who are really imaginative and all of that, then I'm probably going to be, less focused on logic and more focused on pathos, emotion, in order to really appeal to those people. So I might gear my appeals according to who my audience is. So you need to be thinking about that as well as you're writing paper 2. So that's just an overview, and think about this finally too. Again, if I'm up talking to you and I can appeal to you emotionally and tug at your heartstrings, but what I'm saying makes no sense or doesn't seem credible, and I don't seem like a reliable person to you in some way, then my communication can't be a success. So you see how all three, of the appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos, work together to create rhetoric, effective communication. So remember these terms. They're going to haunt you on a quiz, and they're going to be important to understand for paper 2. Thanks for listening.